On the cool morning of April 15th, 2018, the town of Bexley, Georgia, was waking up from a quiet night. However, on the grounds of the state's maximum security prison, the silence was broken by the sound of closing steel doors. Nala Connors, a 26-year-old inmate, had been here for 9 months. Those 9 months were filled with reflection, solitude, and unanswered questions. She sat on an uncomfortable metal cot, leaning against the cold gray concrete walls, slowly processing the events that had brought her here. On this day, she was scheduled for another round of questioning with lawyers and police officers who were still trying to uncover the truth about that tragic night. As part of the ongoing interrogation that began in August 2017, investigators were trying to piece together the emotions and events that could have driven Nala to kill her husband, Trayvon Maxwell. Detective Jared Hall was meticulously reviewing the case files, but none of the existing theories provided a complete picture. "I wasn't trying to kill him," Nala said, slowly enunciating each word as she replayed the moments in her mind again and again. Her memories were fragmented, lacking a clear logic, which only complicated the case. On April 15th, Nala began recalling events that started weeks before the wedding, moments when she first sensed something odd in Trayvon's behavior. But her thoughts kept circling back to the wedding night, the culminating moment she couldn't forget, no matter how painful it was. With each new detail, each new memory, Nala dove deeper into the unsettling atmosphere of the days leading up to the wedding. Her internal anxieties were growing stronger. April 1st, 2018, marked the start of serious wedding preparations. As usual, Nala tried to control every detail, overseeing flowers, decor, and invitations. However, strange occurrences began happening from the very start of April. A subtle unease surfaced in every interaction with Trayvon, taking on new forms. For example, on April 3rd, she noticed he spent more time on the phone and seemed nervous, as if he was hiding something. On the evening of April 4th, 2018, during dinner when they were discussing wedding expenses, the power suddenly went out. The house fell into an eerie silence. The blackout seemed like a coincidence, but in Nala's mind, it lingered as something ominous, almost like a warning of the misfortune to come. In the days leading up to the wedding, Nala couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She remembered how, on April 8th, late at night, she heard rustling outside their home. She got up and walked to the window, but saw no one. Silence surrounded the house, with only the sound of heavy rain tapping on the roof. But that silence, combined with the rain and strange blackouts, stuck with her for a long time. By April 15th, 2018, when detectives began asking more questions about the events of that night, Nala was withdrawing further into herself. Her memories weren't just about the moments before the wedding, but about her inner turmoil. She was still trying to find answers to the questions that tormented her. Why did Trayvon betray her? When did it start? And what made her lose control? Detective Hall continued his questioning, each of his inquiries carefully crafted. They wanted Nala to recall as many details as possible. Hall knew she was missing something. There was a key moment still hidden. "Did you notice anything strange before the wedding?" he asked, watching her reaction closely. Nala sighed, her fingers trembling as she tried to recall what had felt off at the time. After a long day of questioning, Nala returned to her cell. Her mind once again filled with flashbacks. Only this time, they felt even more vivid. She could hear the rustling from that night before the wedding, see the brief glances Trayvon exchanged with Zora. Every memory took on new details, and she realized the answers lay in those moments, when they first began betraying her. In early April 2018, the atmosphere in Bexley, Georgia, began to shift. This quiet, provincial town, nestled in the greenery of trees, was not only known for its picturesque streets and peaceful life, but also for its dark history, passed down through generations. The story of the curse of the unfaithful always resurfaced in conversations, especially when someone mentioned infidelity or betrayal. The legend of the curse of the unfaithful first appeared in the late 1800s, when several mysterious murders occurred in Bexley. It was said that those who betrayed their families or broke vows were doomed to meet a tragic end. Locals recounted the tale of one of the wealthiest families in town being destroyed by infidelity. The husband, who betrayed his wife with her sister, was found dead weeks after the affair was exposed, and his lover disappeared without a trace. Since then, the legend became part of the town's folklore, instilling fear. Just before Nala Connor's and Trayvon Maxwell's wedding, strange events began to occur in the town. On April 10th, 2018, after lunch, a sudden downpour started and lasted late into the evening. This rain was the first in a series of unusual weather events that persisted for several days. It's like nature itself is crying, Nala thought as she gazed out the window at the endless streams of water running down the glass. The town was flooded, the streets deserted, and the sky ominously gray, creating a feeling of oppression and dread. Local residents said such heavy rains were a bad omen, especially before significant events. Nala couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. She began to notice that the people of Bexley seemed to know something she didn't. In a conversation with an elderly neighbor, the old woman hinted that the town was under bad omens. That phrase stuck in Nala's mind, but she tried not to give it much importance, dismissing it as superstition. The next day, April 11th, something unexpected happened in the house where Nala and Trayvon lived. Around 11 a.m., the power went out. It lasted only a few minutes, but left a strange feeling of unease. At that moment, Nala was sitting at her desk when she felt a cold chill run down her spine. Power outages in Bexley were rare, and this one seemed inexplicable to her. When Trayvon returned home that evening, Nala asked him about the electrical issues, but he shrugged it off, saying it was just a coincidence. However, by nightfall, the tension grew. At 2 a.m., they woke up to a strange sound. It was as if someone was quietly whispering outside the window. When Trayvon went out to check, he found nothing, but the fear and tension stayed with Nala. That whisper reminded her of the stories about the curse she had heard from the locals. 2 days before the wedding, on April 13th, 2018, the weather worsened again. The rain fell all day, and by evening, a strange darkness descended, feeling almost menacing. The rain seemed endless, as if the town was waiting for something terrible to happen. Locals began recalling the curse again, discussing it in kitchens and shops. Some said that these weather phenomena and strange noises could be signs of impending disaster, especially during important events like weddings. Nala, who had been preoccupied with wedding preparations in the past days, couldn't help but notice that her neighbors were giving her increasingly anxious looks, as if warning her of something. The night before the wedding marked the climax of these strange events. On April 14th, the night before the ceremony, the wind picked up, and the rain lashed against the windows with incredible force. Nala lay in bed, unable to sleep. The house was quiet, but from time to time, she thought she heard footsteps in the hallway. When she checked, all the doors and windows were locked, but it didn't ease her anxiety. Around midnight, as the town was plunged into darkness, another power outage occurred. This time, it lasted almost 10 minutes. During that time, Nala felt a strange sensation, as if something invisible was watching her. The curse, which she had heard so many stories about, now seemed more real than ever. In the days leading up to the wedding, Bexley seemed frozen in anticipation. The weather, power outages, and whispers outside the windows became part of a collective feeling of impending catastrophe. Locals couldn't help but notice that Trayvon and Nala's wedding coincided with a period of strange occurrences, only fueling their superstitions about the curse. These atmospheric details weren't just a backdrop. They became a symbol of what was to come. The unbearable tension seemed to press down on the town, and perhaps nature itself was warning of something irreversible that was about to happen. Nala Connors had always been known for her determination and resilience. Coming from a modest family, she had fought for success all her life, building her career and reputation. By 26, she had achieved everything she had dreamed of. She had a home, a career, and a man she loved, Trayvon Maxwell. But as the wedding approached, starting in April 2018, her confidence began to crack. Nala had always prided herself on her independence and the fact that she had built her life on trust and honesty. However, something in Trayvon's behavior in recent months had started to unsettle her. By early April, she noticed that Trayvon had become distant, often staying late at work and becoming more secretive in his interactions with her. On April 4th, 2018, while they were organizing wedding plans together, Trayvon suddenly became nervous when her phone rang, and she accidentally saw a notification from an unknown number on his screen. Her heart raced, but she decided not to give it much importance. However, from that day on, her unease began to grow. She started watching his behavior more closely, which only deepened her fear of losing everything she had worked so hard to build. Nala had always struggled with a deep-rooted fear that her world could collapse in an instant, like a house of cards. This fear had been with her since childhood, when her family faced financial hardships. On April 6th, while she and Trayvon were planning their future honeymoon, she couldn't shake the feeling that their happiness was hanging by a thread. Her intuition told her something was wrong, and this anxiety became her constant companion in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Trayvon Maxwell appeared to be a successful and charming man. Behind his smile, however, were hidden ambitions and a talent for manipulating people to get what he wanted. It was always important to him to maintain his image as the perfect man, successful, loved, and respected. But behind this facade was someone who had become accustomed to controlling others for his own benefit. April 3rd, 2018. Trayvon had been living with an internal tension for some time. His affair with Zora Burton, Nala's best friend, was his escape from the ideal world he felt trapped in. Though he loved Nala, her strength and confidence had become stifling to him. He sought something more: adrenaline, excitement, something he found in his relationship with Zora. Their affair had begun months earlier when they started secretly seeing each other. Trayvon hadn't planned on cheating, but once he tasted freedom, he couldn't stop. His meetings with Zora weren't just a distraction anymore. They had become a way for him to avoid responsibility. April 7th, 2018, after one such meeting, he started to worry that things were getting out of control, but he felt drawn to Zora like a magnet. The affair gave him a thrill he missed in his calm life with Nala. As each day passed in the lead up to the wedding, Trayvon felt his two worlds colliding. By April 10th, 2018, just days before the wedding, he could no longer hide his inner tension. He was beginning to sense that Nala was growing suspicious, and this only amplified his anxiety. He tried to maintain the illusion of a perfect life, but his mind was consumed by his affair with Zora. For Zora Burton, the affair with Trayvon wasn't just a romantic entanglement. It was a carefully calculated revenge that had been brewing for years. Zora had always lived in Nala's shadow. They had been best friends, but over time, Zora felt like she was constantly overshadowed by Nala's success. Nala was strong, confident, and always got what she wanted, while Zora often felt like she wasn't enough. Zora secretly envied Nala. On April 4th, 2018, she took her first step toward revenge. She initiated the affair with Trayvon to feel some control over the situation. For Zora, the affair wasn't just about taking Nala's man. It was about destroying something sacred to her: faithfulness and trust. With each secret meeting, Zora felt like she was gaining more and more control. By April 9th, 2018, after spending the night with Trayvon, she realized she had nearly achieved her goal. Trayvon was entirely in her grasp. He was pulling away from Nala more and more, and Zora reveled in it. Her motivation was not just to ruin their relationship, but to prove to herself that she could control the situation. However, Zora had another hidden motive. She was participating in a psychological experiment that studied human emotions in extreme situations. This experiment was kept secret from everyone, including Trayvon. For her, it became a survival game where she manipulated people not just for personal satisfaction, but for the sake of the experiment, which gave her a sense of power. By April 13th, 2018, the day before the wedding, Zora felt on top of the world. She could see Trayvon sinking deeper into guilt and anxiety, and Nala spiraling into fear and doubt. It was exactly what she had aimed for. But even then, Zora couldn't foresee just how far the events she set in motion would go. February 2018. The relationship between Zora Burton and Trayvon Maxwell started with innocent flirting, which quickly escalated into something more. Their first meeting took place after a business dinner where Trayvon had invited Zora as Nala's companion. They exchanged glances that, for Trayvon, seemed like a playful game, but for Zora, it was the beginning of her carefully crafted plan. March 2018. By mid-March, their flirtation had turned into something far more dangerous. They began meeting in secret, choosing secluded cafes and bars far from the city. On the surface, it seemed harmless. Trayvon didn't think their relationship would go beyond flirting, but he didn't realize that Zora was already actively controlling him. For Zora, the affair was a way to demonstrate her power. She used her knowledge of Trayvon and his weaknesses to keep him on a leash. For example, during their meeting on March 15th, she casually mentioned that she knew about his financial troubles, hinting at a possible solution. But helping him wasn't her goal. She wanted Trayvon to feel her influence over his life. The more dependent he felt, the deeper he was drawn to her. By April, their relationship had become more than just an affair. It was a tool Trayvon used to manipulate both women to achieve his own goals. Trayvon skillfully played on Nala's emotions, presenting himself as the loving and devoted fiancé. He knew how to maintain the perfect image in front of her, so she wouldn't suspect a thing. On April 5, 2018, Trayvon used Nala to close an important deal at work. He asked her to organize a meeting with influential partners, which didn't raise any red flags for her. Nala took pride in contributing to their future together, not realizing that her fiancé was already deeply entangled in an affair with her best friend. Trayvon knew how to keep both women close, manipulating their emotions. Zora, on the other hand, was more perceptive. She knew that Trayvon was using her, but it didn't bother her. Her main goal was to control him and eventually destroy his life. On April 7, 2018, when they met at a remote hotel, Trayvon tried to pull back and suggested ending their relationship, explaining that the wedding was too close and he couldn't continue. But Zora, using her manipulative skills, convinced him otherwise, offering just one last time, which only dragged him deeper into her web of games. April 8, 2018. The affair took a more dangerous turn when Trayvon and Zora started receiving strange messages from an unknown number. At first, they were short hints left in text. "I know what you're doing. Your secret isn't safe anymore." These messages came to both Trayvon and Zora's phones, stirring growing paranoia in both of them. Trayvon received the first message on the evening of April 8th while sitting in his car in a parking lot. It was brief. "I see you." He looked around but saw nothing suspicious. At the same time, Zora was at home and received a similar message. Both thought it was a prank or a mistake, but the tension between them began to grow. The next day, on April 9th, they met again to discuss the threats. Zora tried to convince Trayvon that it was probably someone from their circle trying to blackmail them, but she began to feel like she was losing control of the situation. For Trayvon, this was a serious blow. His calm demeanor was shattered. He knew that if their affair was exposed, his life would be ruined. April 10th, 2018. The threats became more specific. "If you don't stop meeting, the truth will come out." This message arrived right before one of Zora and Trayvon's meetings at a hotel. Their affair had now become a game of survival. Trayvon, consumed by the fear of being exposed, became even more cautious. He started thinking about how to escape the situation without losing everything. But each time he tried to end the relationship, Zora convinced him otherwise, reassuring him that everything was still under control. By April 12, 2018, just 2 days before the wedding, their paranoia reached its peak. Trayvon had stopped sleeping through the night, anticipating new messages. He feared that the blackmailer had already revealed their secret to Nala. So far, the threats had only been words, which kept him in a state of constant stress. Zora, on the other hand, continued to project an air of control, but deep down, she was starting to worry. She realized that the situation had spiraled beyond her control, and the blackmail could lead to devastating consequences. But her inner fear didn't stop her from continuing the game. She could see Trayvon growing more anxious, and it only fueled her satisfaction. She felt she was close to complete victory. The wedding ceremony went as planned around 5 p.m. A light spring rain added to the romantic atmosphere as Nala Connors embodied the image of the perfect bride. Guests enjoyed the view of a beautiful garden adorned with white flowers and candles. But for Nala, everything felt surreal. The internal anxiety that had begun weeks before the wedding had now reached its peak. Nala couldn't explain exactly what was bothering her. Every time she saw Trayvon smile and chat with guests, a strange feeling crept over her that something was wrong. At one point, she caught him exchanging a glance with Zora, and it was like a cold blow to her heart. She immediately looked away, trying not to give it importance, but the suspicions had already started to grow in her mind. By the end of the evening, guests began gathering on the dance floor as the music played louder. Trayvon, being the perfect groom, offered to dance with Nala, but she felt more detached by the minute. As they swirled to the slow melody, Nala suddenly heard a strange whisper, as if someone was calling her name. She looked around, but no one was there. She thought it was her own fear creeping into her mind. With each passing moment, Nala's anxiety deepened. She saw Trayvon approach Zora during breaks between dances, and it felt like a dagger piercing her heart. It was only a brief moment, but it felt like an eternity. Zora smiled at Trayvon, and at that moment, Nala heard that strange whisper again. As the rain intensified, the wedding party began moving inside. Guests enjoyed champagne and toasts, but Nala could no longer keep up the appearance of happiness. Her head was spinning with her own thoughts. She retreated to one of the rooms to be alone. Sitting by the window, she watched the raindrops slide down the glass and tried to gather her thoughts. Suddenly, an image flashed in her mind, Trayvon standing with Zora. This vision burned so brightly in her head that she jumped to her feet, feeling panic wash over her. Whether it was a memory, imagination, or something more real, Nala couldn't tell. Everything seemed so real that her mind blurred the lines between reality and hallucination. By midnight, Nala had returned to the celebration, but her mental state hadn't improved. The guests were still enjoying themselves, unaware of the bride's internal struggle. She tried to hold it together, but anxiety was tearing her apart from the inside. The moment Trayvon left the room, she felt an uncontrollable urge to follow him. When she saw his silhouette outside, framed by the pouring rain, her heart stopped. It felt as though Trayvon was walking away from her, and that thought hit her like lightning. She couldn't explain why she suddenly felt the need to find him. It was a strong, inexplicable fear that if she didn't uncover the truth right now, she would lose everything. Nala stepped out into the cold night. The rain continued to pour, the drops tapping against her wedding dress, but she didn't notice. Her mind was clouded with phantom images of Trayvon and Zora. It seemed as though she could hear their voices, their laughter, as if they were somewhere nearby, mocking her. Nala walked through the dark courtyard, feeling like she was on the verge of uncovering a terrible secret. With each step, her anxiety grew stronger until she found herself standing before a door that led to a secluded area of the house, a room Trayvon could have used for secret meetings. Her breathing became heavy, and every sound in the night seemed like it was mocking her. When she pushed the door open and stepped inside, the light flickered, and for a few seconds, everything was plunged into darkness. In that moment, she heard the whisper again, soft, barely audible, as if someone had whispered her name. It was like a sign that she was about to learn the truth. But was this truth real, or just a product of her paranoia? Nala could no longer tell. By 1 a.m., the tension had become unbearable. Nala returned to the room where she and Trayvon were supposed to spend their first night as husband and wife. But the room was eerily silent. Trayvon was gone. His phone lay on the nightstand, but he was nowhere to be found. At that moment, her heart sank. She could feel her world beginning to collapse. She tried calling him, but the call wouldn't go through. In a panic, Nala began pacing the room, her paranoia turning into full-blown desperation. The fear that her darkest suspicions were about to be confirmed wouldn't leave her alone. As the rain continued to pour relentlessly, Nala made the decision to find Trayvon. Her internal fear had grown so strong that she could no longer hold back. She left the room and headed toward the place where she believed she could find all the answers to her questions. Anxiety and paranoia merged, creating an unbearable atmosphere of psychological pressure around her. That night became a turning point for her, as her world began to crumble right before her eyes. On that night, with the rain and whispers seemingly surrounding her from all sides, Nala faced her greatest threat, her own paranoia and the fear that the betrayal had already occurred. After several minutes of anxiety and pacing, Nala realized Trayvon had vanished without a trace. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest, and her mind raced with dark scenarios she had fought so hard to push away. By around 2:30 a.m., as the rain continued to lash against the window, she decided to go out and search for him. She hoped he had just stepped out for some air, as he sometimes did, but she couldn't shake the nagging thought that things were far more complicated. Nala walked through the empty hotel corridors. Each thought grew more unsettling. Her internal suspicions intensified with each step as she checked one room after another, knocking on doors, but no one answered. Her fear began to transform into paranoia. The rain kept pouring, emphasizing her growing sense of dread. By 3 a.m., desperate to find Trayvon, Nala felt an overwhelming urge to check Zora Burton's room. The thought struck her suddenly, like lightning, and her heart tightened. She knew Zora had been her best friend, someone she trusted. But that night, something had shifted, and Nala could no longer ignore the strange feeling. As she approached the door, her hands began to tremble. Nala knocked, softly, almost gently, as if she didn't want to learn the truth. Zora didn't respond right away. Several long seconds passed before Nala knocked again, louder this time. Still, there was no answer. Then Nala, sensing that something terrible was about to be revealed, tried the door. It was locked. Nala remembered she had a master key card, which, as it turned out, worked for all the rooms in the hotel. With shaking hands, she slid the card into the slot and heard the click of the lock. Her breathing quickened, and she slowly pushed the door open. As the door swung open, time seemed to freeze. Nala stepped inside and saw the thing she had feared most. Trayvon and Zora were sitting on the bed. Their faces were pale with shock. Trayvon quickly stood up, and Zora remained still, as though she had been expecting this moment. For her, this was the culmination of her carefully orchestrated plan, and she wanted Nala to see it all with her own eyes. Nala stood frozen, her eyes filling with tears, but she couldn't cry or scream. Inside, everything was falling apart. She looked at them as though they were strangers. The shock was so overwhelming that all her emotions seemed to vanish. Trayvon took a step forward, trying to explain. His voice trembled, but the words meant nothing. He started saying something about it being just a moment of weakness, that they didn't mean to, but Nala no longer heard him. Zora, on the other hand, sat quietly, watching her friend's suffering. For her, this was the final act of her manipulations. She wanted to destroy Nala and knew that this moment was her victory. Everything happened in just a few minutes, but for Nala, time stood still. She looked at Zora and Trayvon, realizing that her life had been shattered. She wanted to ask them 1,000 questions, but her mind simply couldn't process the flood of emotions. At some point, she stepped back, slowly retreating toward the door. Her breathing was heavy, her heart thudding in her chest, as though on the verge of breaking. Nala didn't know what to do next. The shock paralyzed her movements, and she couldn't focus. Suddenly, she felt her fears turning into anger, anger that grew with every passing second. Everything she had worked for had been destroyed in one night. All her efforts, all her dreams, everything was gone. As Nala stepped back toward the door, her eyes met Zora's. There was no remorse in Zora's eyes. Instead, there was something cold and satisfied, as though she had just won a battle she had been preparing for years. Nala realized that this wasn't a coincidence, that it had been planned, and that Zora had orchestrated everything. Trayvon tried to speak again, but Nala could no longer hear him. At that moment, the last thread of control snapped in her mind. She couldn't hold back any longer. Her hands shook, Her heart raced in a wild rhythm, and her vision blurred. She felt as though she was on the verge of fainting, but then her rage took over. This moment became the culmination not only of Trayvon's betrayal, but also of Zora's carefully planned game. Zora knew that Nala would find them together. She had orchestrated everything so that Nala would stumble upon it herself. Her goal was to destroy her friend's life, and now, as she watched Nala's reaction, she finally got the satisfaction she had been seeking. For Nala, it was the final straw. Everything she had been holding back erupted to the surface. Her anger reached its breaking point. Nala stood in the doorway, her world destroyed, her heart shattered. Trayvon and Zora, the betrayers, sat before her. Their voices no longer mattered, nor did their excuses. At that moment, time slowed, and her fury began to consume her mind. Nala could no longer hold back the avalanche of emotions that had been building inside her from the moment she entered the room. The silence in the room was so thick that Nala could hear only her own heavy, uneven breathing. Trayvon said something, his voice trembling as though he was trying to calm the situation, but his words were nothing more than white noise against the backdrop of her raging fury. Her vision was clouded with red. The only thing she could feel was the cold, sharp sting of betrayal. Her gaze accidentally fell on a large glass vase sitting on the nightstand nearby. The object was heavy, its edges gleaming in the dim light of the room. Without much thought, Nala took a step toward the vase, her hand reaching for it, and in that moment something inside her broke. Her mind seemed to shut down. All those years of struggle, all her fears, her love, and trust in Trayvon, they all merged into a single moment of hatred. Trayvon took a step forward, his face frozen in panic as he realized what Nala was about to do. He managed only to say her name, trying to stop her, but it was too late. Without hesitation, Nala raised the vase above her head, and with a scream that shattered the night's silence, she brought it down on his head. It all happened in an instant, but it felt like an eternity. The sound of the impact was dull and sharp, like the snap of a broken branch. Trayvon froze in place, his eyes wide with shock, and then his body collapsed to the floor. The vase shattered, pieces of glass scattering across the room. Nala stood still, her breathing ragged and uneven, her hands still gripping the broken shards. Blood began to slowly seep from the wound on Trayvon's head, forming a pool on the carpet. The red stain grew with each passing second, and Nala couldn't tear her eyes away from it. At that moment, the reality of what she had just done began to sink in. Shock turned to horror. Zora, who had been watching the entire scene unfold, sat frozen on the bed. Her face showed shock and surprise, as though she hadn't expected things to go this far. But deep inside, there was a quiet satisfaction. Her plan had worked. She knew Nala was now destroyed, that she would never again be the strong, confident woman she once was. All that was left for Zora to do was play her part to the end. Slowly, Zora rose from the bed, her gaze meeting Nala's. She feigned horror, as though she hadn't wanted this to happen. But deep down, she knew this was the ending she had been working toward all along. "Nala, what have you done?" Her voice trembled, but it was a carefully rehearsed emotion. Inside, she was celebrating. She had broken Nala, just as she had planned. Nala stood over Trayvon's body, the blood continuing to pour from his wound, and her hands shook with shock. She couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Her mind, as if torn apart, struggled to piece the details together. She knew there was no going back. Her life had ended the moment she struck the blow. Zora stepped closer to Nala, as if to offer comfort, but in that moment, something else flickered in her eyes: triumph. It was a subtle, barely noticeable expression of satisfaction. She knew that Nala had nothing left now. This moment was her victory, and she relished every second of it. The room was engulfed in dead silence. The only sound was the quiet patter of raindrops against the window. Finally, Nala let the shards of the vase fall from her hands, which had begun to bleed from the cuts. Her gaze was empty, and she slowly sank to her knees next to Trayvon's body, as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. Zora stood nearby, watching the scene like an audience member in a theater, knowing the play had reached its final act. Her role had been played, and now all she had to do was make sure Nala took the full blame. This moment was not just the climax of Nala's rage, but also the culmination of Zora's long manipulations, leading to this tragic finale. The next morning, on April 15th, 2018, Trayvon Maxwell's body was discovered in the hotel room. The police received a call from a hotel staff member around 6 a.m. after a housekeeper found Nala Connors in a state of shock next to her husband's body. The room was covered in shards of the broken vase, and a large bloodstain spread across the carpet. Nala's hands were stained with blood, and she made no attempt to hide her guilt. Her eyes were hollow, distant, and she sat silently beside the body. The police arrived quickly at the crime scene, and Detective Jared Hall, leading the investigation, began reviewing the evidence. The room was in chaos. Shards of glass were scattered on the floor, and the vase had clearly been used as a weapon. At first glance, everything pointed to an uncontrollable burst of rage caused by a moment of betrayal. Nala didn't resist arrest and was immediately taken into custody. The day after Nala's arrest, the police began a thorough investigation to understand what had led to such an outcome. During interrogations, Nala didn't deny her guilt and confessed to striking Trayvon with the vase, but she continued to insist that it had happened in a moment of uncontrollable anger after she found him with Zora Burton. However, Detective Hall sensed that the case was far more complex than a simple crime of passion. In the first few days of the investigation, new details emerged. The police began examining Trayvon and Zora's phones, uncovering a series of threatening messages both had received in the weeks leading up to the wedding. The messages were anonymous, and the sender clearly knew about the affair they had been hiding. This became the key to understanding that Trayvon and Zora had been under blackmail. On April 20th, 2018, the police gained access to Trayvon's bank records, revealing large cash withdrawals shortly before the wedding. The money was likely used to pay off the blackmailer. The investigation into these financial transactions led detectives to realize that Trayvon had more secrets than initially met the eye. As the weeks of investigation continued, detectives began focusing on Zora's role in the events. She had been the only one in the room with Nala and Trayvon at the time of the murder, but her behavior during the interrogations raised suspicion. Zora tried to portray herself as a victim, claiming she knew nothing about Nala's intentions. However, Detective Hall noticed that her statements changed with each interview. On May 8, 2018, police recovered deleted messages from Zora's phone, which shed light on her manipulations of Trayvon and hinted that she may have known more about the blackmail than she initially admitted. Additionally, the messages mentioned some sort of experiment involving infidelity and psychological pressure in which Zora may have been a participant. Further investigation revealed Zora's connections to a group of psychologists studying human behavior under extreme conditions. This discovery became a turning point in the case, proving that Zora was not just an innocent party, but had actively engaged in manipulations that ultimately led to the downfall of both Nala and Trayvon. The trial began in late May 2018 and quickly became a media sensation. The courtroom was packed with reporters and onlookers eager to learn the details of the love triangle that had ended in tragedy. Nala, who had pleaded guilty to manslaughter, tried to explain that her actions were driven by extreme emotional distress. Her attorneys built her defense on the argument that she had been a victim of manipulation by both Trayvon and Zora. Zora, on the other hand, attempted to position herself as the victim. She claimed that she had never intended to harm Nala, and that she, too, had been a victim of blackmail and fear of their affair being exposed. However, as the court presented evidence of her involvement in the manipulations, her defense began to crumble. Throughout the trial, more and more facts about Trayvon's double life emerged. It was revealed that he had been involved in questionable financial dealings, which further painted a picture of his complicated character and explained his motives for engaging in a relationship with Zora. By mid-June 2018, after several weeks of testimony, the trial reached its conclusion. Nala stood before the court, having pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and she was sentenced to 10 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 7 years. Her attorneys had done their best to mitigate the sentence, citing her emotional state and the role of Zora's manipulations. Zora, despite her attempts to defend herself, was found complicit in the manipulations and psychological games that had led to the tragedy. Her involvement in the experiment and her active role in influencing Trayvon and Nala became key pieces of evidence. While she wasn't convicted of murder, she was charged with deliberate manipulation and unlawful actions related to psychological abuse. The trial ended, but the fallout from the case continued to ripple through everyone involved. Trayvon was remembered as a man with dark secrets and a double life. Nala, sitting in prison, struggled daily with the knowledge that she had been a victim not just of infidelity, but of a carefully orchestrated conspiracy. Zora, who had tried to escape accountability, ultimately faced public scorn and the destruction of her reputation. This case became a stark example of how far manipulations can go and how betrayal can destroy not just one life, but many. On a scorching day, June 20th, 2018, the courtroom was packed. Tension filled the air as everyone awaited the sentencing of Nala Connors. The court proceedings, which had dragged on for months, had captured the public's attention and became one of the most talked-about stories in the press. Everyone was eager to see how the judge would sentence the woman who had killed her husband in a moment of uncontrollable rage. All eyes were on the judge as he stood before Nala with the verdict in his hands. Nala, who had been in a state of shock since the night of the murder, looked exhausted and drained. Throughout the trial, she had barely spoken a word, simply watching as her life unraveled before her eyes. When the judge pronounced the sentence, 10 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 7, she could barely comprehend it. The judge explained that her actions had been driven by extreme emotional distress, and although she was found guilty of manslaughter, given the circumstances, the sentence was lenient. A hush fell over the courtroom, with quiet sighs of relief and surprise. Nala didn't protest or try to defend herself. She listened to the verdict in silence, ready to take responsibility for her actions. After sentencing, Nala was taken to prison. Her days became a series of monotonous and repetitive events, and she tried to find the strength to deal with what she had done. But despite her remorse, the thought continued to gnaw at her that the situation was far more complex than it seemed. She knew Zora had played a role in the tragedy, but she couldn't prove it in court. The years in prison dragged on slowly. She received letters from her lawyers, kept up with the appeal processes, but it all seemed pointless. Nala couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was buried deeper than what had been revealed during the trial. But after all these years, the investigation had uncovered no new evidence, and it seemed the case would be closed for good. That all changed in August 2022, when Nala, now accustomed to prison life, received a strange letter with no return address. The letter arrived late in the evening, after she had returned to her cell following a meeting with her lawyer. The letter was sealed, with no identifying information about its origin. Inside, there was only a short message. "You don't know everything. This isn't over." These words hit her harder than any of the accusations brought against her in court. Nala instantly knew this message was connected to her case. Her hands shook as she read the letter over and over again. Was this a hint that Zora had been involved in something bigger? Or perhaps someone else knew more about that night than she had ever imagined? Nala felt a cold chill run down her spine, but along with it came something else. Hope. Perhaps the case wasn't closed after all. Perhaps the truth could still be uncovered. But who could have sent this letter? Was it a warning? Or an attempt to help her? After receiving the letter, Nala couldn't sleep. Her thoughts raced as she tried to figure out what to do next. This wasn't just a message. It was a key to reopening the investigation. Now, sitting in prison, she knew she had to keep fighting. Questions mounted. Who was behind the letter? What new evidence had surfaced after all these years? And most importantly, what else didn't she know about that night? Nala's story didn't end with her sentencing. That letter became a symbol that the truth was still hidden behind layers of lies and manipulation. The open ending left space for further investigation and new revelations that could turn the entire case upside down. Nala, alone with her thoughts, realized one thing. Her story wasn't over yet. By early 2023, 5 years after the tragedy, Nala Connors was slowly coming to terms with how deeply her life had been destroyed. Her days in the prison cell were endless, devoid of the ambitions and plans she once had. Every day, she faced the same reality. Her future was now confined to the cold walls of the prison. Over time, Nala began revisiting every moment of her life, from the first time she met Trayvon to that fateful night. She spent years trying to make sense of how the betrayal, first by Trayvon and then by Zora, had led her to this point. But as the years passed, it became clearer to her that her life had been destroyed not just by infidelity, but by Zora's cold, calculated manipulations. Nala recalled every moment of their friendship, realizing that Zora had carefully hidden her true self. Now, years later, the prison walls had become both her confinement and her refuge, where she was forced to come to terms with the consequences of her actions. Since receiving the mysterious letter in 2022, Nala couldn't shake the thought that the tragedy might have been avoided if she had recognized Zora's true nature sooner. Her life in prison became a painful reminder of how easily she had become a pawn in someone else's game. Since then, she rarely communicated with her lawyers, unwilling to reopen old wounds, but the questions about that night still haunted her. Meanwhile, Zora Burton, despite her outward victory and the lack of direct punishment for her actions, also found herself trapped by the consequences of what had happened. After the trial, her life didn't unfold as she had planned. Society began to turn against her, and while she had legally avoided serious punishment, her reputation was shattered. Zora tried to continue her life, but the shadow of what had happened followed her everywhere. People in her circle began to avoid her, and the past became a burden she couldn't escape. By 2023, she realized that her victory over Nala was hollow. The community, which once embraced her as a successful woman, now condemned her as the person who had not only ruined someone else's marriage, but also destroyed her best friend's life. Zora could no longer continue her career at the same pace. Her colleagues and friends began to suspect her of manipulation and even called her an accomplice in the moral destruction of Nala's life. Every step she took was under scrutiny, and the constant pressure from society began to weigh heavily on her. Zora, though free from prison, was imprisoned in a different way. Society had turned its back on her, and even the few friends who had supported her after the trial began to distance themselves. In early 2023, she faced a wave of rumors and whispers that she hadn't just been a victim of the affair with Trayvon, but an active participant in the destruction of Nala's life. More and more people began to label her a silent villain. Meanwhile, Nala, still in prison, continued to wrestle with her inner demons. Her life had been split into before and after the tragedy. Every day, she reflected on how easily trust could be shattered and how betrayal could leave scars that last a lifetime. Her future seemed hopeless, and while she knew that she could theoretically be released in a few years, the thought no longer brought her any comfort. She felt that even if she were freed, her life would never be the same. In August 2023, a year after receiving the first letter, Nala received another mysterious message. This time, the letter was more detailed. "You know they all lied. The truth is closer than you think." These words reignited her anxiety. What else didn't she know about that night? Was someone else involved? Or had Zora, who remained free, been playing a more complex game than it seemed? Now, 5 years after Trayvon's murder, both women lived in their own prisons, one behind real bars, the other behind the bars of public judgment. The fates of both were intertwined forever, but the end of their story remained unclear.